This is the penultimate episode of Season 1 of Make Planning Make Sense. Welcome back and Happy New Year. I'm Aaron Zimmerman and I'm a director at Centro. Our guests this week are Professor Nancy Holman and Professor Alan Mace of the London School of Economics. It's a terrific conversation that invites us to take a step back from how planning and planning reform are often discussed in the public sphere. Please be sure to give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend a favorite episode or two to your professional network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MS Podcast, on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. We're very excited to be back with you next week for the Season 1 finale. Here is our conversation with Professor Nancy Holman and Professor Alan Mace.
Dr. Nancy Holman and Dr. Alan Mace, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We always like to start off with a little bit about who you are and your role.
I am the director of the Urban Regional Planning Studies program here at the LSE. I've been here for more than 20 years. And I primarily am interested in planning in London, planning around things like regulation. So I've done work on permitted development rights. I've done work on housing and Airbnb, things like that. And I've also done quite a bit of work with Alan on planning systems and density.
And I'm Alan Mace. I'm Associate Professor of Urban Planning here at LSE. Been here a bit less time than Nancy. In terms of research, I'm interested in suburbanisation, suburbia, suburban development, but also suburban cultures and planning cultures. So I guess in a broad sense, why planners do what they do.
Is that also your favorite album from Arcade Fire?
Of course.
Naturally. And we have a special sort of connection with the two of you, actually, because our esteemed co-host, Alex, is an alum of your program.
That's
and
right.
Very good he was.
That's right, yeah.
And if I could shamelessly cross-promote as well, I have been very grateful for the privilege of being invited to speak as a guest lecturer in the RUPS program. So thank you for that.
So this kind of centerpiece of the government's agenda, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, you've researched the dynamics with it between national and local government that might play into how we deliver those 1.5 million new homes. And when we think about what's standing in the way, right? Why can't national government just tell local authorities to grant more planning permissions? Why can't we just get more schemes through the planning system? What might be preventing or incentivizing those developments to come forward?
Okay, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting in what you just said. And I think it in part goes to the debate around delivering more homes, because it often gets framed as delivering more planning permissions. The IPPR has just got a piece of research out that says from 2007, over 1.4 million homes haven't been built out that have actual planning permission. So there are a lot of permissions out there and a lot of shovel-ready sites that just haven't been commenced. So that's one side of the coin. It's not necessarily about delivering more planning permissions, although there are certainly arguments about making the planning system a bit more seamless, a bit more quick. But it's also about incentivizing developers to actually come forward and develop those sites. That's not to bash developers, because they have their own reasons for actually not fully building out quickly, because it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to do so. But I think we get into these debates sometimes where it's bashing planners or bashing local councils for things they don't necessarily have a lot of control over.
Yeah, I think that's something we've heard here on the show numerous times, that it's not just planning, it's also building regs, it's also interest rates, it's build costs, it's so many other factors that don't just relate to planning permissions. But we're planners, so we're going to...
So the PIB, or soon to be the pill, if I may. Alan, do you think it's going to do what we need to accelerate housing delivery to meet need in the right places?
Yeah, so I guess just a background to this lesson. It was a special issue from Political Quarterly that we were asked to contribute to. So a number of housing specialists also have articles in the same issue. And I guess presented with the question, we could have had a one-word article. Is the government going to deliver 1.5 million new homes? Answer, no. But it would have been a very short article.
How do you spell eh?
So we obviously had to write more words to say no.
Yeah.
And a colleague, Paul Cheshire, has the same quote. And so I guess the article is an elaboration on the word no to several thousand words. But I think what we were really trying to get at through that was this sense of, rather than doing any simple blaming, that really it's about understanding the complexity in the processes. So central government's intention of delivering these homes, it's a long way between that and the house finally being built and somebody occupying it. And we were trying to elaborate that through an existing theory, because that's what us guys do in academic articles. So there's this idea of the principal agent. And so that if ever you pay a builder to come into your house, you're the principal and the builder is the agent. And any of us will know how difficult it is to get the agent to do what we want. They never quite do what you're expecting. And in the same way with central government wants local authorities to develop more housing. However, because local government generally doesn't do the developing of the housing, there's another tier to the story in the academic literature, which is the idea of orchestrators and intermediaries. So that the local government becomes an orchestrator when it seeks to deliver housing, because it has to deal with builders and landowners who are the intermediaries. And the details of this don't matter too much, but the point is that there's not a direct line of control or command between central government saying we want more houses and builders and landowners selling land and builders building it. And so we use this kind of theory of principals and agents and orchestrators and intermediaries just to talk through some of this complexity. And there's two things I'd want to focus in on that. Is firstly, I think there is a danger for central government to get too focused on their relationship to local government and just seeing it as, if we just incentivize local government enough, if I incentivize my builder enough, problem solved. Because local government still has to deal with the complexity of persuading landowners and developers to develop. And as you've said, there's interest rates, there's taxation, there's regulation. All of these things complicate the story. So I think that it would be a mistake for central government to oversimplify the problem in its own head. And then the other element that I think comes out through looking at it in this way is that central government itself, at the same time that it's telling local government to deliver more housing, it can also be preventing that through changes in regulation, different forms of taxation, changing various parts of this movable feast. So again, I think it's about drawing central government's attention to its role in frustrating local authorities in delivering housing. So I think it's a useful model from that perspective.
Because if you look back at a lot of urban policy and urban regeneration policy over the years, you find that often governments like really simple answers. They want something that is saleable, that is something you can put on a soundbite, put on a poster, and this is going to solve our problems. It's the planning system. That's what's making us not build housing. So it's a simple thing, simple solution. We will compel planners to give more permission so that the market will provide more housing. Really, it's such a macro and simplistic view. It doesn't take any of those other factors into any kind of consideration because that's too messy. And it would actually make governments have to say, look, it's going to be very hard for us to deliver 1.5 million homes. It really is. We need to work with so many different movable parts in this story. Governments don't want to say that because that doesn't sell. That doesn't sell to the electorate. It's much better to say the problem's planning. We're going to punish local councils that don't produce enough planning permissions quickly enough. And end of story, this will work. And by the time the political cycle goes around, the problem hasn't been solved, and the next group of people come in and make another claim and make another set of policies that history would seem to suggest aren't going to work either.
No, this all makes perfect sense. And of course, we're coming at it always from a planning perspective as planning agents, make planning make sense, trademark. But it is something that we're proud of as well, that we're always clear that planning is a problem. And we know that to be true through our own lived experiences, and then also talking to the ways that, the complexity and the risk that you need to take on makes development for SMEs financially sort of unreachable. And then we've seen the resulting collapse of the SME developer sector. But it's a problem, right? And it's not really to anybody's benefit to either focus just on one thing, or to say, yeah, but what about them? It's not me, but what about them, right? But I also do appreciate the sort of challenge of actually mapping out all of the constellations of these interrelated incentive structures, restrictions, inhibitors, and, each of those being as a set different for every actor. It's got to be quite a night sky once you put all those constellations up. So how do we start to think about an holistic solution, which theoretically as well would have at least sort of like the first thread to tug? Where would you start, really?
Again, I think one of the insights of the article is that central government can tend to see local government as the problem or the block. But of course, it's central government that sets up much of the complexity of planning, and much of that constellation to which you're referring is the product of central government. And yet central government ignores that when it says we need to speed up planning and deliver more housing. In the article, we take one example that had been put into place by the government. So we look at the Green Belt, Grey Belt policy. We're not saying it's the only thing, it's one bit of your constellation. Mm-hmm. We use that as an example to say, if central government is really serious about a step change in the system, about really shifting the system, helping small developers, medium-sized developers coming back into the system, we do need some significant step change in how the system is structured, or we need to rework the constellation. And so we look at the NPPF and Grey Belt, and our argument there is that this suggests to us that the government isn't really prepared to be that bold in the changes it's making in order to signal to developers that there is a new landscape out here, and maybe to bring new people into the process. I'm speaking for us here. I have to say there's a slight more me than Nancy, probably, to be fair. But one of the arguments that I made is that we could use Greenbelt reform, not to get rid of all Greenbelt, not even to get rid of the majority of Greenbelt, but it's a very important sort of totemic representative policy. And if the government were prepared to be bolder in its challenge to the existing policy, one of the things that could do would be to signal to landowners and developers that there is a preparedness to really rethink the current parameters of the planning system. Importantly, that might change some of the psychology, the behaviours, the way people, landowners and developers act. Because effectively, one can argue, well, developers are perfectly logical people who act and manage their business within the context of a certain degree of land constraint. If you were to signal that was changing in a reasonably significant way, you might then shift their business models or their behaviours. A sort of a more radical rethink of Greenbelt policy. Grey Belt is a somewhat tinkering around the edges. And just in a pro-planning, pro-Greenbelt way, I think another reason why Grey Belt is rather limited is it's still just working on the sort of existing opportunities of previously used land within the Greenbelt, rather than stepping back and going, look, we've had this policy for decades. What do we want it to do now in the time we're in now? It was set up in a very different time. Yeah. How could it be reworked to look very different, but to more positively achieve some of our aims, including biodiversity, which is not something that Greenbelt's particularly focused on? And at the same time, how might we remodel the Greenbelt in order to release land and signal to developers a change in land availability?
In thinking about how to unpack these very complex dynamics between principals, agents, orchestrators, intermediary, something that it reminded me of when I got to that part of your article, when you started talking about land supply and Grey Belt, is how there's a very different dynamic between when you have a very constrained land supply situation, when you have a developer with a very constrained site in terms of viability and a local authority that then needs to assess that application. The dynamic becomes one of a regulator. It becomes one of my job is to say no. Whereas if you have a situation where in scenarios such as with development corporations, for example, or in boroughs with a better land supply situation, or indeed with Grey Belt, right? When you have a bit of land supply and you can say, we're giving you some room here, in return, let's start to negotiate. Those seem two very different dynamics to me. So A, what are your thoughts on that? And B, how does it change the dynamic when the signal is coming from national government and then the regulatory capacity sits with the local government?
Okay, I'm going to say two things. One is much more broad. One is a little bit more specific. So I'll start with specific first. I think in the scenario you're describing, I've always said, I think you took planning for sustainable cities, and my big takeaway being context matters, which sounds flippant, but it truly is. You know, if you're talking about land supply on something like Greybelt, where you've got a little bit more land, it is hopefully in fewer hands in terms of land ownership, et cetera, then as a regulator, you have more room to play with, because the developer himself or herself also doesn't necessarily have the constraints that they might on an inner borough site in London, where it's very constrained. There may be more than one landowner on a very small site, and it might be hugely contaminated. Then it becomes a much more charged discussion between the local authority, who is trying to get the things that they're supposed to get out of this development because it's cross-subsidized, and a developer who is trying to develop the land at a profit, which is what they do. My broader point to all of this, and I actually agreed with what you said, you know,
Aww.
I mean, when we agreed, we're all loved up. But part of the other problem is that we have a system that to me is a bit insane in the sense that it is cross-subsidized. We have a system that says the developer, because they make immense profits, and in many cases they do make a lot of profit, can pay for affordable housing and now biodiversity net gain. And we have a lot of competing values in the planning system where we want these things to happen. Biodiversity net gain is great. Obviously, you'd like to see more biodiversity in cities on sites. More affordable housing is great. Yes, we need to have more affordable housing in London. But eventually, you've got one part. You've got the developer profit part. And for every single thing that you're asking the developer to do, you're taking up some of that pot. And we can't have everything simply based on profit out of a developer, because you end up dividing it up into infinitesimal parts. So I think in reality, when we have been able to build out and build homes, the state was doing a lot of that. And I think as a nation, we don't want to have more taxation, obviously. We don't like the idea of paying funds towards housing necessarily. But by the back door, with the rising housing prices, we're doing it anyway. We're paying extra tax, if you will, every time we move homes. Or moreover, when our children want to move out of homes and we discover that our 40-year-old son will still be living with us because there is nowhere for that 40-year-old son to buy a place to live. It's something that we pay for as a society. We just don't feel it as a tax.
We feel it as very expensive housing. Sort of like an inefficiency tax or a scarcity tax. Oh, that's sad.
A deadweight loss, I believe they would call it.
Yeah, because as much as I think we probably all pay for housing, it's not going to build affordable housing. You know what I mean? It's just trickling up, right? It's to the freeholder, to the lender, whatever it might be, but it's not social value added.
No, that is part of what planning is meant to be about. It is about trying to help create social value, whether that be environmental, literally social value, even economic growth, where it benefits individuals in that location. But it's very hard to do that in the system that we have, not just the planning system, but the manner in which we expect public good to be paid for.
I guess linking that back to the sort of principal agent, orchestrator, intermediary, again, I think that kind of linear model helps us to remember the intermediaries. We can't direct builders to build, so we've got to keep the balance of incentives and costs somewhere in a sweet spot that is going to have builders coming forwards with development, contrary to the case we see in London at the moment. But just returning to Alex's point, I think there are two elements in my mind here. So one, if we want to help local authorities to oversee more housing, we want to make that as easy as possible for them where they are willing to do so. Where they are willing agents, we don't want to put too much in their way. But it is also true that there will be unwilling agents. So there will be local authorities who don't want to build, even if we got rid of the green belt and even if we got rid of many requirements for affordable housing and made the whole system much more attractive to developers, then there'd still be local authorities who are trying to then put the brakes on building altogether.
Yeah.
In that situation, and again, I think it's where this model is useful, then I think you focus on the principal agent, and then central government has to think about, well, how do I penalise unwilling agents, local authorities who are not willing to see any development? So there's that role, but then part of the point of the article was alongside getting unwilling agents to do what you want them to do, the other challenge for central government is to make sure that central government itself doesn't put barriers in the way by disincentivising the intermediaries, by disincentivising landowners and builders, which is a kind of nice way of saying it's a two-stage and delightfully messy problem.
We will be right back.
What would it look like to start to maybe incentivize the willing agents?
I think incentive or helping the willing agents is about being aware of legislation, taxation, requirements that just make it more difficult, either make it more difficult to build or challenge viability. I don't want to sound like I'm completely making a case for the poor beleaguered builder, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that, as Nancy was saying, we've got to be careful about what we layer onto them in terms of our expectations and what maybe needs to come out of the tax system more generally. I think in terms of willing agents, then it's about not putting national legislation in place or requirements in place that discourage landowners from coming forward and developers from developing. I think the unwilling agent relationship is much more something that's a direct relationship between central government and local government, where there's a sort of a series of increasing penalties for local authorities that don't meet targets. And that seems reasonable to me, as long as you're not then making it impossible to deliver on those targets through various expectations on landowners and developers that sort of render their models uneconomic.
I think another interesting thing that we saw in the planning headlines recently that also reminded me of this principal agent top-down dynamic was the package of support for house building that was announced in October, where the Mayor of London and government announced that they would be making some
shifting the dials.
But among those measures was to cut borough level CIL for certain schemes in half, but not mayoral level CIL, which is an interesting kind of top-down move. So there is some degree of forcefulness that can be exercised from the national to the local level in getting the local agents to fall in line, basically.
I guess the thing we've not really talked about yet, but certainly Nancy and I had this conversation as an insight into a co-published article. You know, there's disagreements that go on in the background before the apparent unity of the written article. And again, because we're doing a loving, Nancy was quite right to point out the sort of the elephant in the room, the unspoken thing is, if central government is really going to seek to incentivize developers and builders, then one of the real questions or challenges is, what are the restrictions we're going to lift? Or in other words, what are the things we're no longer going to seek to achieve through the planning system? And that's a difficult conversation. And I think perfectly understandable for government is it's a very difficult conversation. It's easy to say, well, we're going to make the planning system more efficient and we're going to deliver more housing. But that means we're going to ask for something less. If the planning system is about society saying this is what we want from built development alongside just simple market profit models, then we have to start to say, what are we not going to ask for to come out of development? And taking your example, Alex, the sort of reduction in the affordable housing targets in London is another example where it's like, well, okay, we'll incentivise development, we'll reduce affordable housing targets. That's a difficult call. So it's not that these things are easy. And I hope one of the things coming out of the article is an attempt to be empathetic both to central government and local government as well as developers, that all of these complexities are because these are very difficult, real world matters to deal with. And it's not easy, central government to say we are going to roll back on these things that previously we were seeking to achieve through planning.
I think we've said it in a similar way before, which is sort of what are the priorities? Because of course we want BNG, of course we want reduced flood risk, of course we want net zero carbon, of course we want adequate cycle parking spaces, of course we want the bins to be closest to the highway to ease the burden of collection, of course we want a whole bunch of family-sized units, of course we also want diversity in our housing typologies, of course we want 35% affordable housing. And when you add on the best intentions of every sort of stakeholder in the sector, you get very little of anything because you sort of get stuck, okay, net zero housing at scale at a price that people can afford. We haven't achieved that yet. We haven't figured that out. 35% affordable makes perfect sense, but these aren't boom times. And if you look at the actual overall delivery over the past 5 years, 20% is probably much closer to what is actually coming forward in a housing market-wide perspective, although the variation between sites is still going to be quite significant. What would your priorities be?
Oh, that's a tough question to throw at us. I'm going to look at Nancy.
That's unfair. That's unfair.
Okay, so maybe this is where some of the benefit of the UK planning system and the discretionary planning system could come into play, where I would be keen to see local government being given more discretion, more power to make those decisions. Mm-hmm. I'm going to slightly avoid your question.
I'm noticing. It's all right.
I listen to a lot of politicians on Radio 4. So again, coming back to the Greenbelt, and actually this is what got me into the Greenbelt research originally. I was talking to some people from London Borough of Enfield up in the north of London. They've got a lot of Greenbelt. And I was really surprised because as local politicians and local planners, they wanted to go further in terms of releasing Greenbelt. This is several years ago now. And it really challenged my ideas at the time because I would have assumed that the local authority level, that would be where you get the most resistance to any Greenbelt reform, because that's where you're going to take the flak from your electorate for releasing Greenbelt. So my assumption would be no local authority would want to have that conversation. And yet they did. And from their point of view, it was the sort of Mayor of London and central government that was stopping them from acting more in terms of them setting a local priority and saying, we're willing to surrender or change some Greenbelt because we see that there are big social equity issues with Greenbelt in terms of the east and the west of the borough. So coming back to your question of what would my priorities be? So my priority would be to allow local authorities to really set out more freely their priorities and to be more free at the local level to then say, we want to be braver on challenging Greenbelt because we see that the net disadvantage is running against our poorer community. So I think it's about really fulfilling the rhetoric. Central government so often talks about we really believe in local governments and local governments understand their local population. For me, it's about really putting that into practice and allowing a much greater discretion on the part of local authorities to decide what their priorities are. Amongst that you put it very well, Aaron, that it is a huge smorgasbord of things that we want to achieve. And each one of them is reasonable. But I think we really need to think at the local level, which of those is really important to us in any given local situation.
And I might go and stick my neck out a tiny bit further, although I do agree of the local authority and making priorities. And I would say that within a local authority, those priorities may differ site to site. But I have a real concern borne out by what we see in the world today, that if you ignore social equity, you do so at your peril.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that with movements from the far right gaining a lot of power in a lot of places. And if you leave people feeling left behind and indeed leave them behind, you're not creating the kind of society that can take care of itself. And you are aiding divisive language and divisive politics. And that I find is a seriously worrying and present danger. And trying to understand social equity, and that is with employment, with housing, with what have you, is actually something that is vital right now.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the biodiversity isn't important, and I'm not saying that no carbon is important. I'm not saying that those things aren't good, but I am saying we do need to be very concerned, especially in communities where there are a great deal of people left behind who feel disenfranchised, quite rightly so, who don't have access to housing and things like that.
Yeah. Coming back to the findings of your article, the dynamics between agents, principals, when you think about how to bring forward more land supply for development to try to achieve those 1.5 million new homes, Grey Belt is one approach. However, that is not without contention. The other way, if we don't make greenfield Grey Belt land available for development, is where does that development then go? It needs to go within brownfield sites, within our existing developed areas. And what does that mean? Additional density. And that's not without contention either. How can we achieve density within London? And why might in certain localities people be resistant to additional density?
Okay, I just want to give a sort of a name check to Barney Stringer, who's at another consultancy, but he did some work for, it was entitled When Brownfield is Not Enough. Excuse me, naming another consultancy.
I know.
But the reason I mention Barney is he sort of made the point, if we look at the housing crisis as it is, we need to be on a war footing. This is the scale of the response. It's almost a war footing scale, that we can't be fiddling around the edges in order to change. And just coming to your question, I would not want to think in terms of the solution is either building on the green belt or increasing density or building above shops or changing the suburbs in some ways. So his basic argument is we need all of these. We need to be trying all possible options, pulling all levers in order to address the scale of the problem that faces us. So in that context, I think just to come on to the density article, I'd see this as being an article that sits alongside the other article as two different ways, of addressing the scale of the problem. We were looking at residents' response to density in the suburbs, and we have a colleague who does some very groovy stuff, both with adapting images in order to do tests with people. Got some very clever statistical stuff, which I have to announce up front. The statistical stuff in the article is his rather than mine and Nancy's. However, what we did is we basically surveyed just over 900 suburban residents. We showed them a series of images. We've got 3-story development, 6-story development, 9-story development. And then we manipulate the images. For example, the fenestration, make bigger windows, smaller windows. We change the vegetation around the building. So plants around the building, or fewer plants, more plants. So we change a number of things. And then we don't show each person all of the pictures. Each person gets to see a selection of these pictures. And we're basically testing two things. First of all, the perception of density. Do people see these as being very dense, slightly dense, more dense? And also their acceptability. So how acceptable would this be as a form of development? And we were really trying to get to, if we're going to densify in the suburbs, how much can design make a difference? The good news story is that our 3-story suburban development, design can make a difference and can make densification more acceptable. And that's actually quite significant in that our lowest densification model of 3 stories is still double the density of existing suburban London. So that's the good news. The bad news is once you go to 6 stories, and particularly 9 stories, there's not much you can do in terms of design that makes it more acceptable. You can't design out the fact it's more dense.
There's something very telling about this particular question about showing people photos. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? Because it speaks to a phenomenon that we have in planning, right? Which is that we have this ever worsening crisis, and it has all of these social equity and social cohesion and economic and environmental negative impacts. And then we go to, say, crazy example, the Kingstons of the world. And we say, well, what would you think about this being built? Why are we putting it to a vote? You know what I mean? Like, we're not going to kick you out and make you redevelop your property, but it's sort of an aesthetic show of hands, isn't it? So we have these really real, tangible problems. And then there's that aesthetic, oh, that's tall, isn't it? And I think it's quite an extraordinary political dynamic. I'm not saying, of course, that development is determined yes or no by a show of hands of neighbors, but those neighbors influence committees. So there is a mechanism to it, yeah.
I agree with that point because we were talking with Maurice Lange from the Centre for Cities, who's also an LSE alum. I don't know if you taught him, but we were talking about like upzoning and kind of policy changes that you could have for densification of the suburbs. And from a policy making perspective, it made total sense, right? But then when you look at it from the other side, from kind of a local politics perspective, like local people can be very powerful. And even in the UK, that's not so devolved. Local politics are quite powerful.
Well, they can be, but I think we've got to separate things out. So they're definitely the people who don't want tall, different, more massing near them at all for aesthetics. But there are also people who have genuine concerns about transport leakages, doctors' surgeries, schools, road infrastructure, problems with access to green space, because the more people you put in, the less green space there is per person. And so those are kind of legitimate worries that need to be addressed effectively for people to feel comfortable with density. I think the other thing that I liked about the research that we did is it did talk to this kind of notion that if we just build it prettier, it will be okay. And the reality is government's push for design-led building is probably not the core issue, the key that's going to unlock acceptability. I think one very interesting finding that came out of the paper that we did is those people who found density more acceptable and who perceived it as necessarily less dense were those people who, on the survey, believed there was a housing crisis. So if you thought, yes, there's a housing affordability crisis, I see it and I know that it's there, then your tolerance to having a higher density development near you, regardless really, didn't matter so much what it looked like.
Because it was an article that actually establishes a sort of statistical significance. In fact, your people's attitudes was more statistically significant than differences in the design of the building. And so if you had reported a strong belief that there was a housing crisis, those people both perceived the density in the pictures to be lower than other people, and they found it to be more acceptable. So in that sense, part of the story of the article is there's a sort of battle to be had over convincing people of the extent of the problem. And once you've got people on board with the problem, they are far more willing to accept denser development.
Which goes back to the point of trying to get people to understand social equity and considering how that might play out in a planning process. So there's people who realize that where others were left behind or they were left behind and there was a housing crisis were far more positive on the development. Very interesting kind of story there, because it's not just about the physicality of building it.
Is there potentially also a political consciousness story there? If there's fear of scarcity for GP doctor surgeries, or fear of scarcity for schools, or fear of scarcity for a seat on the train, is there then a corresponding sort of understanding that it's their role as a voting citizen to go and petition the government to pay for fucking schools? It can't be for development to provide everything ad hoc all the time. We're already in a position of scarcity. And so where's the government? Can they not build a school? That sounds really, really flippant, but I think that it speaks to this sort of expectation that what we have is just what it is because that's the natural order of things, and then what the developer wants to do is change it. It's like, well, no, what we have is scarcity amongst several sectors that are driven by political choices, and then developers have to face that sort of frustration. But it's not the developer causing school scarcity. It's not the developer causing long GP waiting times, but they're the ones trying to actually provide a different kind of public good, who are then browbeaten about all of the other things that are interrelated. Discuss.
Yeah, certainly, again, I think it comes, so I think there is a need for a greater boldness on the part of central government to provision the things that we need in order to allow for more development. The London suburbs sort of always fascinate me, this incredibly tight period, 1920s, 1930s, between those two world wars. You have a mass of London being built. Well, it's not even London at the time, but you have a massive house building taking place, often very small developers building a few houses at a time, then buying more land. But what you also have, you've got the massive expansion of the underground system. So you've got new transport infrastructure going on. You have local authorities who are managing the sort of drainage on new sites, preparing sites for schools. There was a kind of a general, for whatever reason, different then, but there was a general preparedness of the state to put in place the things we need on a scale that just makes somehow we look rather timid these days compared to then.
Do you think there's like an anti-economic growth kind of sentiment that's driving that? Do you think there's like a sentiment among people that's like, well, I don't actually believe in this ever continuing growth pattern?
I also think, though, that it's people not believing in state provision of hardly anything. I think that we have lost that kind of idea of providing something like schools, et cetera,
public and civic services.
Yeah, a positive.
I suppose also in terms of a very long picture, there's always been this concern with development, and it's about change, isn't it? So we always take for granted what we've known, and change is the problem. Human beings basically probably don't like change that much. And once we're used to it, it just becomes what's around us. I think it's probably part of the human condition to be uncomfortable with change. And so on that basis, I don't think it's because we've covered so much land necessarily. I think it's a perennial problem. You just want to hold on to what you've got. As soon as you expand your development, people are going to protest about it. I'm guilty of this myself. I can remember when I was working in planning, there were certain proposals for new buildings that I thought were absolute dogs, and they've been built 20 years. And I can honestly say I go past them every day, don't even notice them now. I'm the same. So I think it's a problem. And maybe the question here is about one of leadership for government. That actually I think it's maybe what you guys are hinting at. You've probably got to be prepared to piss people off if you're going to lead. And I think we need government to lead and not to always be trying to assume we can keep everyone happy on that journey.
Yeah, I think there is a political will question and a leadership question, because, what came to mind, Alan, was not only sort of a preference for the status quo, but an unlikeliness to actually question why the status quo is what it is, that we are in a situation that is the result of decisions in the past. And we can make decisions now that can present a different future. But making those decisions is actually part of a recurring cycle. But also that's already like just too pie in the sky to put on a bumper sticker.
But it also requires a lot of knowledge about past events, a lot of complex thinking that in people's day-to-day lives, you don't get a lot of people who would want to reflect on that. If you're trying to think about moving a country with a view towards something, post-war, we had a rallying call about the fact that, we'd had lots of bombing and we needed to rebuild, and we had the rise of the welfare state. And so you had a kind of dominant and popular narrative that a wider group of people could grab onto. It's very hard to create that.
I see what you mean. I've thought about planning and development in these terms before. Is it not a matter of civic pride? Is it not a matter of national pride? And civic and national pride people can get their heads around, right? Is this not a failure to accept the status quo? And would it not be anything but national pride to want better?
Yeah, I was just thinking I want to be cautious about overly crediting the previous government for anything. But in many ways, I think neighbourhood planning, I think there was something there, even if unintentionally, that was still worth hanging on to. And this sense of trying to flip the psychology to where local people were planning for development in their area and seeing the possible positives of development in their area. What could that development contribute to my area, rather than it's going to put more pressure on getting a tube seat? And can we flip that conversation from opposition to well, okay, if I've got to have development, at least I've got some agency and control over exactly where it's going to go. I mean, I guess like everything, it's become somewhat mired in the fine detail of planning legislation.
I think in many kind of European planning systems, you get similar kind of very localized plans where they have a lot more input. I think neighborhood planning had a lot to go for it. But again, like a lot of these things, it wasn't well funded. It's a huge burden on communities to do it.
Yeah.
If you are a community that has a lot of retired people who are middle class and who work in potentially planning as a profession or development as a profession, then it's easier to do. But if you're a community that doesn't have the resources, you're a younger community with everyone of working age, that kind of level of dedication is really hard to manufacture.
Yeah.
So it does take support. It does take financial support to make those kinds of things work. But I agree, it gives you ownership. It gives you a feeling that it's not being done to you, but done with you.
Is there a popular narrative around the 1.5 million new homes? And then perhaps there's just not a popular narrative around how we deliver them?
I wouldn't call it a narrative quite on the 1.5 million new homes. I think it's a popular thought, but I don't know if it's one of those kinds of things that seems too fantastical because it's just been mentioned too much and it's never going to happen. And then I'm not sure anyone ever even has a narrative or has a thought around how it's going to be delivered. You know, I'm not sure, given what the government's doing right now, I'm not sure they have a narrative about how it's actually going to be delivered.
But do we believe there's popular consensus around the need to deliver more homes even?
Sure. There's a popular consensus, I would have thought, in most cities that we need to deliver more homes.
Although another element that we looked at in the suburban densification article, as well as asking them whether they thought there was a housing crisis, we also asked them whether they thought that the housing should be developed in outer London where they were or inner London. And obviously you won't be surprised that there's a whole series of people who we did put into the sort of NIMBY category of, yes, there's a housing crisis, but you need to develop it in inner London. That's where it should be. I suppose, again, and I'm sure you could get everyone to agree, it's a bit like world peace. You could get everyone to agree that 1.5 million homes is a new idea, as long as you don't have to pay for it. In other words, as long as it's not anywhere near you. 1.5 million new homes in Manchester sounds like a fabulous idea to me. And there, I think, actually, coming back to your idea of a narrative, for me, it's an example of the government taking on this leadership role, which I said before, and appearing to be very bold and saying, by implication, we're not worried about the opposition. We're going to fight through the opposition. Here's 1.5 million new homes. But when you look at the changes that are being made, they feel a bit timid to me.
Yeah.
It's really going to lead, into this very different new world of much higher house building.
Which I think we actually answered at the start of the discussion. The answer is no.
I mean, we can bring it all down to one word if you want.
Not yet, maybe. Not yet.
Yeah.
It's a long government and that 1.5 million won't be in this parliament. But if they can get to 300,000 in the last year of the parliament, then that's still something extraordinary.
Indeed, it would be.
It would be, yes.
Yeah. I can't say that it's much more likely, but I think it is something where there still is time. And these conversations, I think, can't do anything but help. Yeah. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.